Welcome back to Mercenarys Star by William H. Keith Jr. We shall continue the saga of the beginnings of the Grey Death Legion.
Clay and his Wolverine was already helping McCall's rifleman to its feet. Grayson winced when he saw the damage the rifleman had sustained, and his mind began cycling furiously through what he would say to McCall. He had ordered the Caledonian to watch for aircraft, but the man must have been so absorbed by the ground battle that he had completely missed the Kurita SL-15 strafing run from his rear. That mistake could have been fatal. It might well have ruined the unit's heaviest mech. A muted roar from the east warned of the Kurita force's departure. Both dropships hovered on laboring thrusters, then turned and arced slowly off toward the south above the jungle. Explosions and rising pall of smoke marked where supplies unloaded during the battle had been destroyed lest they fall into rebel hands or tempt a rebel attack during reloading. As the sound of the Leopard's departure faded, a new sound began rising from the beach and surrounding jungle growth. It took Grayson a moment to recognize that it was the sound of men and women cheering. Grayson touched the Shadowhawk's canopy release panel and swung it open. The outside air, tropically hot and damp, rushed into the Hawk's cockpit like an autumn wind, dry and deliciously cool compared to the hothouse humidity inside. He hung against the overhead stanchions a moment, gulping the air, suddenly aware of how good fresh air smelled compared to the stench of his and Laurie's sweat and fear. The sharp scent of scorched armor also flavored the fresh air. Pings, pops, and creakings of hot metal rose from the Shadowhawk's weapon tubes and from scarred and scorched patches of armor where, briefly, megajoules of laser energy had touched. The cheers continued to sound around him, clearer now than when he'd heard them through the mech's external pickups. Both rebels and mercenary troops were emerging from the jungle, splashing through the shallow, high-tide water, or standing in animated knots among the boles and roots of beach-edge trees and jungle plants. Some exchanged slaps on the back or vigorous handshakes, and many were engaged in animated discussion of the battle just past. Sergeant Ramage and Tolan Brasnowicz were trotting side by side at the head of a mixed squad of troops in the direction of the nearest stranded galleon. The tank's crew was already climbing out, moving clumsily with their hands in the air. Laurie locked the Shadowhawk in place and cracked her helmet, letting Grayson help her swing it off her shoulders and into its rack above her seat. Her hair fell in lank, damp stands across her shoulders. She shook her head and wiped wet hair from her eyes. "Pretty good for someone who was sure she would fail," he said gently. In truth, he'd completely forgotten his concern about Laurie's fear once the battle had begun. She had acted coolly, professionally, without hesitation. She replied with a smile, though her eyes were guarded. Laurie, too, reveled a moment in the cool breeze moving through the open cockpit before fishing a towel out of an equipment locker under her seat to sop the sweat from her face and neck. When she had finished, Grayson used the towel himself. His own uniform was as soaked as her brief attire, and far less comfortable. It didn't cool as the air blew over it, but bunched, chafed, and sent sudden rivulets of sweat tickling down his spine and sides. The water below looked inviting, and he longed for a swim. For the moment, he was too weak to do anything more than hang on and breathe. Nearby, Grayson saw McCall and Clay leaning from the opened hatches of their own machines. The light mech pilots were still relatively fresh, not having sustained combat as long as the heavies. They now stood guard in the quickening tide as a Kurita pilot climbed out of one of the two captured Stingers. The other Stinger, still flat on its back, had taken a round in the head. Smoke still wisped above the gore-shocked scar where the mech's cockpit had been. Laurie smoothed wet hair back from her face. "Captain, if you'd excuse me, I'd like to get dressed." Grayson smiled. "Pardon me for barging into your dressing room, and thanks for the ride." He reached up and punched the winch release that dropped the Shadowhawk's ladder, then lowered himself to the ground, careful to avoid hot spots on the mech's armor. The water under the Hawk was knee-deep on him and felt wonderful when he splashed it across his face. My lord, there was no way we could have reached Hunter's Cape with more mechs or tanks. There were only 2 dropships available, and small ones at that. Stiffly at attention, Kevlavik stood in Nagumo's office at the University of Regis, his eyes focused at the greenish sky through the window behind the Governor General's shoulder. He swallowed once before adding, "We did not expect such fierce resistance, Lord. We thought to find only battered survivors of the dropship's crash. We were met by accurate and concentrated fire from at least 2 enemy mech lances, and possibly a full company. They were supported by a large and powerful guerrilla force with whom they must have established contact moments before our arrival." Nagumo sat quietly, neither accusing nor condemning. "I see. Anything else?" "There was one serious tactical and logistical flaw in the operation that contributed to our defeat." "Yes?" "The dropship Subotai arrived at the LZ almost 8 minutes after the Zhao was down and unloaded. The light tanks were not on the field until my lance was already being forced to withdraw. Had we been able to operate together, things might have gone differently." "Perhaps," said Nagumo, his face impassive, voice non-committal. Close support between mechs and ground support units was always a touchy subject during analysis of battle mech operations. Some commanders swore that close cooperation between troops and light, swift vehicles and the lumbering mechs could vastly increase a mech unit's combat effectiveness. Others argued just as vigorously that ground units got in the way, that they slowed the mechs and hindered their freedom to fire, that accidents and misidentification too frequently caused troops armed with anti-mech weaponry to fire into friendly, valuable machines. Nagumo was a traditionalist who felt mech operations should remain separate from conventional orders of battle, but he was open-minded enough to allow a subordinate such as Kevlavik to approach things in his own way. No matter now, for the blame would rest squarely on his own shoulders. "Perhaps," Nagumo said again. "Then, too, a second lance of battle mechs might have served better. What is the final tally of damage?" Kevlavik noted his commander's use of the word damage rather than casualties, but lost no time in pondering it. In battle mech units, equipment was far more valuable than lives. Humans could be replaced, but in an increasingly lost-tech universe, it was becoming harder and harder to replace man's war machines. "Lord, both light mechs were lost, one with severe damage to the cockpit. We must assume the enemy will be able to field one against us, but it seems unlikely that their service facilities will be up to repairing the other. For the same reason, we can assume their rifleman is permanently out of action." "We can assume nothing of the sort," Nagumo replied, still quiet. His eyes sparked in the harsh office lighting. "There are industrial complexes in rebel-controlled regions, centers for servicing industrial or agro-mechs, especially among the plantations. We haven't found them all, yet." "Yes, my lord. The Orion was badly damaged, but retired from the field under its own power. My senior tech estimates that 70 hours of work will put it back in service again, that all necessary parts and tools are available. My Marauder suffered considerable damage to its armor, and its left arm PPC was knocked out. Again, nothing that cannot be repaired in our facilities here. Of 12 galleons, 4 were destroyed." "Not to mention 1 aircraft shot down," Nagumo interjected impatiently, "and the second so badly damaged it may not fly again." He was particularly worried about the losses to his aerospace fighter force. First the losses during the battle in space, and now this. "The enemy may be able to recover 1 or more of those tanks," he continued, almost to himself. "The reports from the Xiao's captain suggest that 2 of the galleons were merely trapped in mud. When the tide recedes, the rebels may be able to free them with the help from their mechs. Colonel, I fear this debacle will not look good on your record at all." "No, my lord. In fact, I wonder if we shouldn't be looking for someone more adaptable to lead your regiment. As my lord commands." Nagumo appeared to consider, then smiled. The sight of the Governor General's teeth did not put Keflavik at ease. "No, Colonel, I believe that a man must learn from his mistakes. You will have another chance to demonstrate that you are capable of learning." "Thank you, my lord." "Not at all, not at all. In fact, I direct you to take as much of your regiment as you need to hunt these outsiders down. I want that mech unit destroyed, Colonel, before they can offer effective help to the insurgents. You are not to make any more assumptions about the enemy's abilities or weaknesses or strengths. Mistaken assumptions will lead you to underestimate him, to your sorrow. Do you understand?" "Yes, my lord. My patience will not extend to another disaster such as that at Hunter's Cape. You shall not fail me again. Clear?" "Perfectly, my lord." "Then go. I want a progress report from you daily and an operational plan by this time tomorrow. Dismissed." Ilse Martinez leaned over the table that had been improvised from a strip of sheet metal laid across a pair of upright steel drums on the beach. A freshening breeze from the sea and a darkening sky tugged at her curls. Grayson held the map they had been examining flat between both hands. She straightened up, shaking her head. "Captain, do you know what you're asking me to do?" Grayson's glance shifted across to Brezhnev, who fingered the grip on the laser rifle slung over his shoulder and looked away. His expression as much as said, "This is your argument, not mine." "Captain Martinez," Grayson began firmly, "do you know what will happen if you don't?" Though not aboard her vessel, he used the title to remind her of the responsibility of her command, which she already aware of, or she wouldn't be so set against it, he thought. "The Phobos is a spaceship, Captain," she said, "and, at the moment, not an especially good one. We got the leaks fixed, but..." "If we leave the Phobos where she is, the Dracos will be back," Grayson said, "and this time, more of them. We lucked out today. Lucked out, plain and simple, because their attack wasn't coordinated, because they weren't expecting us to be ready for them, and because we had some help from Tolan and his people. If we stay here and fight them again, we'll be wiped out. And if we take off inland with these people," he stabbed at Brezhnev with a thumb, "how long do you think the Phobos will remain intact?" "She's safe enough from storms." "I'm not talking about storms. Look, a dropship is a small mountain of Star League technology and spare parts, computers, weapons, a fusion power plant, and enough power module relays to run an army of battle mechs. Conduits, piping, tubing, and wiring, semiconductors, superconductors, circuit boards, function chips, neural flow circuitry, and God knows what else. The Kurita commanders know a dropship crashed here, and they know she's relatively intact. Intact enough to shoot down their aerospace fighters. They'll have every dropship they can muster back here, and an army to boot, just as quick as they can manage to gather the forces and fuel the ships. They'll expect us to salvage what we can, of course, but how much do you think we could salvage starting now? How long do you think we have?" "Nagumo is not slow about recovering other bits of technology," Brezhnev added. "If one of our mechs is abandoned or destroyed, he has tech swarming over it within hours, even if we blow it with a self-destruct charge. They'll dismantle the Phobos for the armor plate, if nothing else," Grayson said. I know. I don't want old Phobos to fall into their hands any more than you do. Then you have to see that this is the only way. At worst, we sink the Phobos to the bottom of the Azure Sea, someplace where Kurita recovery craft can't possibly get at her. What about my crew? I can't do this alone, you know. It'll be dangerous, but you have a skimmer ready to take you all off. You'll abandon ship if you have to, but we've got to try." She turned from the map and gazed across the line of breakers at the Phobos. The tide had gone out since the battle, leaving a broad stretch of beach between them and the foaming breakers. The dropship seemed higher in the water now that the tide was lower. The crude repairs to the gash in her hull were visible, layers of sheet metal and armor tack welded across the hole. Streams of water spewed from vents in her sides, indicating where damage control parties were at work pumping out the seawater that had flooded her lower decks after the crash. Small, blue-black clouds scudded beneath the lowering overcast. I don't think anyone has ever tried something like this before. That doesn't mean it can't be done. She turned again and looked at the map. It was laboriously hand-drawn, and Grayson wondered about its accuracy. Brzezinowicz had produced it when Grayson had asked him about the geography of the coastline. Okay, we're where? With a grime-coated finger, Brzezinowicz indicated a strip of beach close by a hook of land jutting north into the sea. Here, Hunter's Cape, it's called. And you want me to sail the Phobos by sea all the way across to here? Grayson nodded. To Ostiaford, yes. At the mouth of the Skryalinas River. The village of Wesley is here across the bay. 500 kilometers. More, since you'll have to skirt south of this island here. And you want to tear apart my reactor to do it? Not tear apart. Look. He reached for a compad and stylus, illuminated the smooth data screen, and began sketching in lines of light. The Phobos uses a small fusion reactor to heat and compress hydrogen up to the fusion point, with powerful magnetic fields to contain and direct what amounts to a small, controlled and ongoing fusion explosion, right? Very small and a lot cleaner, yes? Well, the design would also let you simply heat hydrogen, turn it into a superheated gas, and blast that aft through the tubes as reaction mass. That was the principle for the first nuclear spacecraft. You pitch reaction mass aft and it shoves the spacecraft forward. It's also a lot cruder and a lot less efficient than a thermonuclear field pulse. Right, but we don't need efficiency here. No, what we need is fuel. We ruptured our hydrogen tanks in the landing and lost what little was left of our fuel reserves. We're going to have to cook some more H if we're going to move it anywhere. That's just it. We don't need to use H if we convert the drive to a simple reaction mass engine, he sketched rapidly. We jury-rig intake valves here, here, and here and pump in seawater. The pumps circulate the water through the fusion reactor, which burns the H you have left just to produce heat and keep your weapons powered up. Steam is vented out the tubes. We flood the ship. Flood? Just a little, just enough to give it some balance and keep the jet tubes underwater and to give her a bit of its list. Steam blasts out of the tubes underwater and you travel in the direction of your list. She chewed at her lip, staring at Grayson's doodles. There are a lot of practical problems. Grayson waved stylus and pad. I don't give a damn about practical problems, he said. You know your ship, and you have a small army of engineering techs and officers who can lick practical problems. If not, we'll give them guns and stick them with the foot soldiers. Ilsa tore her eyes from the pad and brought them up to meet Grayson's. God damn, she said, and the words were almost reverent. You want me to convert my dropship to a steam-powered sailing ship? She shook her head and moved the compad aside so she could again study Brezhnevich's chart. I must be getting as crazy as you are, Captain. You got me thinking about ways to... She stopped short. Look, assuming we can do it, what about our Kurita friends? Something as big as a dropship quietly cruising across their ocean. I don't think they're going to care for that. They know the Phobos is here at Hunter's Cape. You make the conversion as fast as you can, before tonight if possible. Tonight. The word was a wail of protest and horror. That would be lovely, thank you. I'm not sure how much speed you'll get out of her, but you have unlimited fuel and the fusion-heated steam is bound to give her quite a shove. Your speed may be limited by the ship's structural integrity, but I imagine you'll be moving at a pretty good clip. You'll travel at night. If you leave tonight, we can probably count on this cloud cover holding, and that will protect you from infrared detectors in orbit. I doubt that they have radar scanner satellites in orbit. That'd be impractical on a planet with this much jungle mixed with open terrain. By the time they get a ship here, tomorrow sometime, I imagine, you're well out of their way. Their first assumption will be that the Phobos broke up in the surf or in high winds. They're not going to believe that we'd actually try to sail her across 500 clicks of open sea. You got that right. If the cloud cover breaks, there's a chance you'll be spotted, of course. With luck, you could make it all the way to this fjord without being spotted, and the enemy will be left thinking the Phobos is at the bottom of the Azure Sea. It wouldn't take much for them to be right. She looked again at the wreck of the dropship. rolling slightly with the swell now that most of the water had been pumped from her lower compartments. "You're right," Martinez said at last. "It's worth a try, though God help me, I don't know how we'll be able to sail tonight." "We can't wait for tomorrow," Grayson said. "It'll take them at least until then to collect an army to throw at us, but no longer. Not if they want to stop us from stripping the dropship. They'll be here tomorrow, say, by local noon. You've got to be a good 100 kilometers out to sea by then if you don't want their air cover to spot you. You'll lend a hand with your people and some mechs for muscle?" "Of course," Grayson said, thinking about the light mechs now aboard the Phobos, unloading the Locust. "In fact, it would probably be a good idea if you took one of the mechs along with you. We don't know what you'll run into once you reach land." "I wouldn't mind someone riding a shotgun." "Fine, now which one?" "I need the Locust with me." He trusted Lori's instincts as a scout, and her mech speed would be wasted aboard the Phobos. "And the Wolverine and the Rifleman are my heavies. You could have Dabrowski's, Joruli's, or Khaled." "I'd suggest Khaled. I know he's had plenty of combat experience. I don't know how either of the other two would handle independent duty." She chewed her lip and then said, "Khaled then. The guy gives me the shivers, but you're right about his experience. It shows, even if he doesn't say much." Grayson nodded. "Good. I'll tell him." "Then we'd better get started. So help me, Captain Carlyle. If I get seasick on my deck, I'm going to see to it that you have the fun of cleaning it up." Grayson watched Martinez stride down the beach, waving for a skimmer to carry her across the water to the Phobos. The plan to save the dropship was one born of desperation. So much could go wrong. Shaking his head, he rolled up to the map and returned it to Brzezinovich. "What's next for the rest of us, then?" he asked. "Devik Iridin had planned for us to meet with your Revolutionary Council." "I could take you there, I suppose," the big man said, "but it's a long march through thick terrain, all jungle and swamp, like this." He waved behind him toward the tree line. "And worse." "Impenetrable for mechs?" "No, at least, I don't think so. We've got some mechs, but no one who can pilot them in combat." "How's that?" "Oh, we have lots of guys and gals that can operate mechs because of the many plantations burned out from the jungle below the basin rim through here. Most of them use agro-mechs to plant and harvest their crops, and there's a big logging operation off to the east that uses big, four-legged mechs to cut strip and drag trees. Piloting an agro-mech isn't all that different from running one of these things." He gestured toward Grayson's Shadowhawk, standing empty on the beach nearby. "We've got some battle mechs, too, left over from the little planetary defense force from the days before Kurita took over. And some were brought in by government militia mech warriors who got tired of doing Nagumo's garbage details. Those militiamen are not very well trained, especially not against other mechs." That was understandable, Grayson thought, because the Kurita occupation forces would not wish to encourage an active battle mech force with well-trained pilots within their puppet government army. They would use Verthandi and government mech lances as oversized policemen on riot control duty to scatter mobs and to awe disgruntled populations, rather than as actual combat units. Anyway, agromechs follow those trails all the time. Hell, most of them are old forest logging roads made for logger mechs in the first place, years ago. Our battle mechs don't get out much, but when they do, they don't get into trouble if they stay on the main forest roads. Off the roads, it's different. There are places that'll suck a mech down in the blink of an eye, mud pits that are as good as bottomless so far as a 20-ton piece of machinery is concerned. But you'll make it if you stick with us. Well, that's it then. Will you take us? Brzezinovich rubbed at the stubble on his chin. Well, Grayson folded his arms. If you're looking for payment, we don't have much to offer you. A proper share of the booty we took today would go right, the rebel said. Like those tanks over there. We took them, your mercs and my boys together. Were you mercs figuring on drafting them into your army? Grayson laughed, raising his hands, palms out. Right now, I've got all I can worry about, looking after my own equipment. If that's the coin that'll make us go to where we're supposed to go, by all means, take them. The rebel brightened. We'll take them off your hands then. And if you want, I'll loan you some of my techs to get them up and running. Brzezinovich looked surprised. You're generous for a merc. That again. There's more to this than money, friend. At this point, I'm more concerned about turning our two armies into one. The rebel looked thoughtful, and Grayson guessed he was thinking about problems that command of such a joint effort army would create. The man's face cleared, and he no doubt reached a conclusion that such decisions are best left to the Revolutionary Council. Right. I'm sending some of my skimmers on back to Fox Island ahead of our main column, Tallon said. They'll take my wounded and also the news that we've got these tanks on the way. You want to go with them? I don't think so. I'll come in with my people and my mechs. Yeah. Sounds good. Well, that Eridan fellow can go on ahead to let them know we're coming. They're a bit touchy about unannounced visits. Understandable. I have to see to the fitting of our dropship first anyway. And he looked up past the rebel commander's shoulders and saw a stocky form standing alone further down the beach. If you would excuse me, I have to talk to one of my people. I've been keeping him waiting deliberately, but I think he's been stewing long enough. Brezhnenovich snapped off an informal salute by touching up the rolled-up map to his brow. Right you are, then. But we're going to have to move fast. I'd like to be off this beach and moving by midnight. That'll depend on how fast they get that dropship afloat, Grayson replied. But we'll certainly do our best. If we're not ready by then, leave us a scout and we'll follow. Grayson had not been looking forward to this interview with Davis McCall. He liked the lanky Caledonian, liked his cheerful manner and carefree grin, but likable or not, McCall had a dressing down coming to him, and the responsibility to deliver it was Grayson. McCall, there are unit commanders who would have you shot for what you pulled this morning. Aye, sir. There were shouts in the distance and the clank of heavy block and tackles being hauled up to the flank of the damaged rifleman. A dazzling pinpoint of light appeared and wavered at the mech's twin-barreled arm where a Legion Aztec was at work with a cutting torch. Sparks danced and showered on the ground. Since joining the Grey Death, McCall had shown an almost touching affection for his Bannock burn. Grayson could tell from the man's eyes that he longed to be across the beach with his beloved war machine as repair crews cobbled together repairs enough to keep her moving and fighting until she could reach a secure machine shop. McCall remained at attention, however, his eyes focused somewhere within the jungle canopy above the beach. I ordered you to ignore ground combat if necessary to concentrate on your detectors, Grayson continued. If that Slayer had been carrying an Inferno cluster, we wouldn't be standing here talking about it now, would we? No, sir, the Caledonian flexed his hands and rallied. But, sir, the Micklin Wee fighter had gone when his wingman was doomed. I dinna ken. You didn't think, damn it. I can't have people in my unit who have to be told how to think. Sir, you're not booting me out of the Legion. If you mean terminating your contract, no, I'm not. Grayson looked hard at McCall, his gray eyes cold. The rifleman is yours and we need your rifleman. Nor would I turn you loose here with no place to go but the Governor General's camp. Mostly, though, I don't want to lose you. You're a good man, Davis, and good men are more precious than battle mechs. New light rose in McCall's eyes. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me. Prove your gratitude by following orders next time and by using that thick Caledonian head of yours. Forget it now. Where's the damage? Och, my poor wee bairn was snickering good. My Bannock Burn's left arm actuators were junked, and both legs took in a lot of damage. Never mind the details, how long to fix it. Well, sir, her part arm actuators are kill it, and that D2J detector antenna needs replacing too. Captain, the Bannock Barn needs a refit, and we don't have a repair facility, damn it. We don't have anything but what we brought here on the Phobos. How much to get her underway again? She'll move no under her ain steam, Captain. They get her into fighting trim. Oh, ouch, another 10 hours. But that poor lassie now be using her port arm of weapons until we get her a new actuator group, and that's something we now have here. And her fire control will be here by gosh just until we replace her D2J. That poor lassie will have to make do until you get her to a heavy machine shop, but you have your 10 hours until we reach a rebel base, and maybe we can see about actuators when we're there. I understand there are a lot of agromechs produced on this world, and we might be able to adapt one to your needs. Aye, there's that. With the right tools, I could tinker something to make it do. Good, you're pretty good at tinkering, aren't you? Oh yeah, I help saving Scottish ancestors, Ken. Well, I'm delighted to hear it. As of now, I'm pulling you off of Bannockburn. Sire! Shock marked McCall's face, and he cast another worried, longing glance at his crippled mech. Gratian shook his head. Those techs over there can get her ready for the march to the Rebel HQ. I'll put my own tech, Tomlinson, on the crew. Right now, I want you out on the Phobos, helping rig her pump and heat seawater. Seawater, sir? Seawater. You're going to help teach the Phobos to swim. You can consider that your punishment for disobeying orders. Grayson returned the astonished mech warrior's salute and walked over to where Brzezinowicz was waiting in the shade near the tree line at the far edge of the beach. Everywhere, men and women struggled with heavy equipment or wandered in seemingly aimless patterns across a beach, strewn with debris and the refuse of a small army. From further up the beach came the grumbling of diesel motors as the galleon tanks were fired up and sent clanking down a trail that a rebel guide had pointed out in the forest. The rebel army, uncertain what to do in the midst of this purposeful chaos, lounged in small groups in the shade of trees, dicing, playing cards, talking, sleeping, or simply watching the frantic activities of their unexpected new allies. Somehow, Grayson was going to have to transform this chaos into a fighting army, or the Grey Death would never leave Verthandi again. Chapter 12. It stormed during the night, but throughout the rest of the long Verthandian day, Grayson's people had worked to refit the unit's battle mechs, to unload necessary supplies and equipment from the Phobos, and to ready the dropship herself for the sea voyage. The conversion of a gut-torn dropship into an unwieldy and practically unsteerable, steam-powered boat was risky enough that Grayson wanted to salvage all the equipment he could before consigning the vessel to the mercies of the Azure Sea. The actual refeeding of the pumps and conduits that would gulp in seawater took only a bit more than 5 hours, speeded up with the help of mechs able to lift massive sections of hull plate or machinery weighing nearly as much as they did. The longest part of the refit was the transfer of bulky mech harnesses, booms, and repair rigs from the mech bays to the shore. It was 2 hours past dark when the Phobos was ready to set sail. It was already raining, with wind gusting and wave-flattening bursts that caused the lightened dropship to shudder. The motion aboard was queasily uncomfortable as the dropship moved with a slap and lurch of the waves. The tide was in now, and lightening the ship's holds had brought her off the bottom. The motion was made worse by the fact that selected outboard holds along one side of the cargo deck had been pumped full of water, giving the ship a 20-degree list. Movement along her decks was treacherous and accomplished by slowly and carefully planting feet and hands with each step. Grayson picked his way across the Phobos' bridge. Martinez was in her control seat, strapped in against the increasingly violent efforts of wind and wave. "A storm is up, Captain," he said. "It is indeed, Major," she replied. Now that the Phobos was again a ship, in the purest sense of the word, Grayson had his honorary, if temporary, promotion back. That could be a bit of good luck. Grayson nodded. "It means the Dracos won't have recon aircraft up tonight, and you'll certainly be screened from enemy satellites. Their patrols won't be close enough to pick you up on infrared scan either. Hell, it means they'll think we broke up and sank in the storm. Well, it's about time our luck changed." "I'm glad you feel that way, Captain, because you've got to sail this thing in weather I wouldn't care to face inside a Marauder." Martinez touched a panel on the armrest control block. One of her console monitors came up, displaying a computer-generated map. It was based on the Azure Sea charts that they had been studying earlier in the day. She used a stylus to trace across an arm of the sea to a convoluted thrusting of water onto the land. "The Skraelingus River, any idea of what's there?" "None, beyond what Brzezinowicz was able to tell us," Grayson replied. "There are plantations nearby, and he says their owners support the revolution. You should be able to trade machine parts and such for food." "Food doesn't bother me. It's hiding from the damn Dracos." "This storm won't last forever. and a dropship will show up to a satellite like a big fat bug on a dinner plate. Only if they catch you at sea, Captain, under clear skies. The cove Brasednovich told us about here, you should be able to ground the Phobos there, where the tide won't move her, though you might have to wait for high tide to do it. It's close in under the rocks of those cliffs, just inside the mouth of the Ostia Ford. You've got camouflage netting enough to hide the ship, as long as you douse your reactor to kill your infrared signature. I'm not doubting the analysis. We just don't know what it's really like there. Suppose those rock cliffs are too low or there are unmapped sandbars that keep me from getting close. Suppose I can't get the Phobos close enough under the cliffs. Suppose, oh hell with it, I'll worry about it when I get there. She looked at Grayson, her dark eyes somber under their tattooed wings. Wish you well, Grayson, she said, the formalities of command forgotten for the time. I hope to see you again, soon. You've got a skimmer ready in your number 3 hold. If you start to founder, let the old tub go and abandon ship. We can join up later. It's not me I'm worried about, Major. It's you. I'm not sure I trust these Verthandians yet. And you folks have got a long way to go, she laughed. I'd rather face 500 kilometers of open ocean in a storm than that damned Kurita-infested jungle. He smiled and extended his hand. Ilse took it gravely. I'll get word to you somehow, he said, shaking her hand. Just as soon as we're set up with a decent headquarters, supplies, repair facilities, and so forth, then we can see about getting the Phobos spaceworthy again. For now, Major, I'll just be happy if she stays seaworthy. The rain was driving up the beach in sleeting walls, pelting at Grayson's face and hair with a savage fury. He heard the dropship's engines throb to life, a deep, rumbling sputter that carried above the pounding of the surf and the roar of the wind and the rain. Visibility was so low, however, that he couldn't make out the ship as she got underway. Good. That meant that other eyes in the jungle wouldn't see her departure either. Moments later, the combined column of rebel and mercenaries set off into the jungle on their own voyage. The rain offered advantages to the land party as well as to the seagoing Phobos. Rebel forces traveling through the jungle were always threatened by Kurita satellites or orbiting spacecraft spying down from 200 kilometers overhead. Though Verthandi's skies were frequently cloudy and the jungle canopy provided nearly unbroken cover across most of the Sylvan Basin, there were frequent clearings and stretches of open ground. Even a fragmentary patch of blue-green sky might be enough for a satellite to catch sun glint and the movement of a hovercraft column. Battle mechs pushing along the jungle paths were harder still to hide. The rebels had long ago learned to move through the jungle by night and to take advantage of the blessed natural invisibility offered by clouds and rainstorms. The secret rebel base in the Verthandian Revolutionary Council lay across almost 400 kilometers of jungle, and it took all night to get there. Verthandi was, above all, an agricultural world. There was heavy industry centered around the principal cities, of course, and petroleum and various metal ores. Chromite, principally, and bauxite were dug or pumped from the edge of the deserts to the south. It was the fertile land along the jungle basin slopes that was Verthandi's most important economic asset, however. Paradoxically, the soil of the lush jungle floor was impoverished, leached beggar poor of minerals by constant water erosion. In most places, the jungle canopy was so thick that not enough sunlight entered to support undergrowth, resulting in surprisingly little dead vegetation or humus. The swamps were another matter, bottomless layers of muck and ooze stinking with decay. Neither terrain was suited for farming. Verthandi's fertility existed in the area known as the Sylvan Basin, which had been formed in ages past when a massive asteroid had smashed out a depression in the planet's jungle belt. The land sloped down sharply from the encircling high ground plateaus and rugged mountains. At the northern base of the slope, in a narrow circle around the world's pole at roughly 60 degrees north, was a fertile zone where erosion from the southern slopes combined with runoff from the spring floods on the high plateaus. The land here was wet, laced with swamps and stretches of tropical undergrowth far more impenetrable than any true jungle. Scattered here and there among the bogs were islands, Solid ground where plantations raised kevla, blue leaf, and garl bean, as well as bananas, sugarcane, cotton, and grovicas. Further into the swamps were clearings for rice, rubber, and jute. High along the basin slopes, the steep-sided jungle ridge called the Basin Rim, there were plantations that grew coffee and cocoa. Despite the war, the Dracos had attempted to keep up the flow of the world's lifeblood of commerce. Verthandi's puppet government in Regis continued to collect taxes in the form of a percentage of each harvest, and dropships loaded with jute, rubber, garl bean, cotton, or blue leaf periodically roared skyward from the prairie north of Regis to freighters waiting in the system's jump points. The image of trade and productive economy was largely shown by this time, however. All across Verthandi, many abandoned plantations had fallen into rot and ruin, while villagers went to war against one another. Like all revolutions, the war on Verthandi was as much a civil war of neighbor against neighbor as it was a revolt against foreign masters. Grayson had learned or guessed much of this from conversation with Iridin on the voyage from Galatia. He learned more in the night-long march through the jungle, speaking with Tolan Brzdadnowicz on a short-range directional microwave comm circuit that allowed them to question one another without alerting possible eavesdroppers on the mountain ridges above. He was, therefore, somewhat prepared for it when the rebel hovercraft led the mercenary mechs and hover transports across a shallow stream and into the village. Fox Island was a large and fertile wedge of solid ground lying at the confluence of a pair of rivers flowing from the foot of the Blue Sword Plateau. The Erickson family had owned and operated the Fox Island plantation since the world was first colonized by Terrans of Scandinavian descent over 600 years before. Gunnar Erickson was a clan head and owner now, and his landhold was a fair-sized village tucked away in the verdant blue-green of the jungle-shrouded island. Everywhere, knots of people busied themselves on uncrating supplies or disassembling machinery. The knocking of hammers could be heard farther back amongst the trees where a new warehouse was being hastily constructed. High in a treetop, a pair of rebel troops stood out on a narrow camouflaged platform, TK assault rifles cradled in their arms. Not that the rifle or the lookouts would be of much use in a sudden airstrike, but the discipline was necessary and the routine of military duties comforting. Indeed, the whole camp had a reassuringly professional but relaxed atmosphere. Eridin reminded Grayson that these rebels had been fighting Kurita soldiers and the troops of the Kurita puppet government on Verthandi for nearly 10 years, and those who had survived this long were very good at what they did. They fought to keep their world from dying, for the Draconis Combine was systematically stripping the world bare. The government dropships that ferried goods skyward were carrying them to freighters bound for Luthien and other worlds of the Combine. When the ships returned, they brought back, not machine parts or automated equipment, but Kurita soldiers and battle mechs. Propaganda had it that the legitimate Verthandian government had hired these as protection from attack by the Lyrian Commonwealth or the rebel bandits who skulked in the forests of the Sylvan Basin. The existence of the rebel base fascinated Grayson. According to Tolan, Kurita satellite photos of the area revealed only workers in the Fox Island fields, with no unusual activity among the countless clearings and inhabited areas that dotted the island. In fact, those workers were rebel soldiers. On those infrequent days when the skies were clear, however, most of the rebels went indoors or underground to avoid detection by the enemy's spy satellites. When officials from the puppet Verthandian government arrived to assess taxes or to investigate rumors of armed men or jungle-based smugglers, they saw nothing out of the ordinary, or at least so far they hadn't. As Grayson brought his Shadowhawk to a halt in the broad clearing in front of a long, low mansion with a sweeping roofed veranda, rebel soldiers and technicians gathered to watch the arrival of the 6 mercenary battle mechs. It was still raining, and though the high winds and lighting of the night before had fallen off, despite the weather, the rebels' work went on. They seemed to be raising a new building, with the help of a wasp and a pair of civilian mechs of unfamiliar design. Here, too, the rebels made the best use possible of chance clouds and rain. Judging by the progress on the building, the structure would be up and well camouflaged by the time the sun shone in the village clearing again. The members of the Verthandian Revolutionary Council met Grayson as he descended from the ladder of his mech. Devik Eridan was there, looking far fresher than Grayson felt after his trek through the jungle. For the first time since Grayson had known the man, Eridan was smiling broadly as he introduced the other members of Verthandi's Revolutionary Council. Gunnar Eriksson seemed to be the group's leader, though there was no identification of relative rank. Grayson sensed the others deferring to him. With his prematurely white hair, he had the bearing of a man born to this world aristocracy. As the village, the plantation, and the island were all his, Grayson gathered that he spent much of his time playing the loyalist landowner who paid his taxes and who maintained a small private army on his own plantation to guarantee the loyalty of those who lived there. In reality, his island had become the headquarters for the largest rebel army in the region, for reasons geological as well as political. The grip of his handshake was strong, and when Grayson admitted he'd heard much about the man, Eriksson's laughter was hearty and genuine. James Jungle Jim Thorvald was another descendant of Verthandi's Norse settlers. Tall, blond, and broad, his politician's smile had won him a seat on the Council of Academicians before the coming of Kurita's legions. Outlawed for anti-Combine agitation after the new order was proclaimed, he had fled to the jungle plantation. When Kurita forces leveled Thorvald fast and poisoned the water, he had become General Thorvald. He vanished into the Sylvan Basin, emerging only to raid Kurita camps for food and supplies, and eventually gathering an army in the lowland regions north of the Blue Sword. Fox Island became his alternate headquarters. Storehouses and barracks on the northern fields, his army's secret camp. The tall and lovely Carlotta Helga Meyer was scarcely more than a girl, but one of those rare individuals able to convey an air of aristocratic elegance while clad in grease-stained tech coveralls or camouflage fatigues. She was, in fact, on the academic staff at Regis and still maintained her teaching post there. She explained that the Kurita masters commanded that life go on as it always had to foster the illusion that life was normal now, that the rebels were nothing but misguided bandits, and that happier memories of self-government were the warped maunderings of ungrateful malcontents. Academician Helga Meyer was the Rebel Alliance's link with rebel groups within the city of Regis itself. There were, she assured Grayson, hundreds, perhaps thousands of brave men and women within the walls of the university, only waiting for the chance to join the uprising that would drive the Kurita conqueror off Verthandi forever. Dr. Carl Olsen was also from the plantation village further to the east, in the Frieshaven district, and represented one of the largest and best organized of the rebel bands on the planet. He said little but admitted to Grayson that his own son was among those whom the mercenaries were expected to train. Grayson already knew much about Devik Eridan. Born and raised in the city of Viornes, several hundred kilometers west of Regis, he had been elected by his fellow rebels to represent them when the Revolutionary Council was formed. Quiet and retiring to the point of timidity, he resembled nothing so much as an owlish university professor. Though he might not resemble a rebel leader, Grayson knew that Eridan was the one who had volunteered to board a dropship under the guns of Kurita troops, and then to take passage on a freighter to another world, where he could find and hire mercenaries. It had been Eridan entrusted with vanadium stolen from Kurita convoys to buy supplies the rebellions needed, and Eridan, who had found and hired the mercenaries needed to forge an army capable of fighting against Kurita mechs. Grayson found himself admiring Devik Eridan more than any of the other Verthandians he had met so far. Sitting with the 5 leaders, drinking the bitter local coffee and rich Verthandian tea in the library of the Eriksson mansion, he realized that this was a revolt of the world's aristocrats. With the possible exception of Eridan, every one of these rebel leaders were members of what Brzezinowicz referred to as old families, descendants of the Scandinavian settlers who had come to Verthandi 6 centuries before. Grayson had learned earlier that Brzezinowicz family had arrived 2 centuries later, emigrants fleeing the devastation of the succession wars on planets deeper within the inner sphere. There was a subtle tension between the old families and the latecomers, the ones still referred to by the people of Scandinavian heritage as refugees. Private animosities and feuds had been set aside for the duration of the revolution, or so it was claimed. Grayson wondered how long the state of affairs could last. "We certainly appreciate your coming here to Verthandi, Captain," Erickson said to him by way of welcome. The others nodded agreement, but the atmosphere remained reserved, slightly formal. A copy of the contract between the council and the Grey Death lay unmentioned on the elegant white cloth that covered the table where they sat. Grayson's eyes widened slightly when he saw that a small, flat plastic case lay beside the contract printout, a case with a lone, glowing red eye of a power indicator light at one end. It was a pocket transcriber, and it was recording their conversation. So, he thought, this is for the record, just in case there's a dispute later and we must go before the bonding authority. These folks are cautious. Erickson continued, smiling. "We have long recognized the need for outside help in our struggle against the Combine." "We'll do what we can, sir," Grayson replied, then gestured at the printout on the table. "Our contract specifies that we are to form a training cadre and drill your people on the fine points of anti-mech warfare. I gather, too, that you have small nucleus of battle mechs and want our help training pilots." "Precisely, Helga Meyer," said Helga Meyer. "We have a large army, weapons, and the support of most of the people. But without special training and equipment, soldiers are no use at all against battle mechs." "It's the training more than the equipment, ma'am," Grayson said. We'll do what we can for you." "There is one small point," Olsen said, but he seemed nervous, ill at ease. His eyes strayed to the recorder. "Yes, sir?" "Well, a couple of points, actually. Yes? One is the matter of command. Another is your participation in combat here." "Ah," Grayson thought, "so that's it." "There should be no problem there," Grayson said. His voice smiled. "The contract specifically places my unit under the direct commander of your council. In short, you give the orders, and we obey, at least so far as those orders don't put my command unnecessarily at risk. That's just it. Your actions upon landing at Hunter's Cape have already put your command at risk, Captain. We did not hire you to engage in battle with the enemy." "Eh?" "Citizen Eridan has explained the terms of the contract he worked out with you," Erickson said. "To be frank, we cannot afford to pay for your participation in combat." "I understand that, of course," Grayson said. "We also have an obligation to defend ourselves." "When the enemy ships landed," Olsen said, "you could have slipped away into the jungle. Kurita forces rarely track our people far under forest canopy. That's fine for your people. We had certain equipment that had to be offloaded, including the military supplies your agents purchased off-world. I also had to see to the safety of the dropship." He did not add that the Phobos was by now well on its way to Osta Fjord. He wondered if he should also caution Brednovich not to mention the fact. The strain in Grayson's new relationship with these people was a tangible presence in the room, and that strain bred distrust. "We couldn't let all that fall into the enemy's hands." Thorvald spoke for the first time. "So as long as you understand, Merc, if your people get killed and your mechs get shot up, we're not paying your bill. That's for the record." "Understood," Grayson said, keeping his voice carefully neutral. "That's our responsibility. I do hope your hospitality extends to your mech maintenance facilities and repair shops. We took some damage at Hunter's Cape, and you expect us to make it good?" Thorvald was openly hostile. "The contract specifies routine resupply and maintenance." "Routine, Captain, routine." Helga Meyer looked from one face to another of those gathered around the table. "We are not unreasonable, Captain Carlyle, and certainly you are welcome to use our facilities, but we want it to be clear from the start." Her eyes indicated the quarter for the record, Captain, that we have brought you here to train our people, not to fight for us. "That is clearly understood, Citizen Helga Meyer." Thorvald appeared mollified, but was still gruff. "We can't expect off-worlders to understand our struggle. We fight for freedom, not money." That again, there was no point in arguing. "I understand, General, but I must make it clear, for the record, that the Grey Death Legion will defend itself in any way that I, its commander, deem necessary. If that means we take on the whole Kurita army, we'll do it." He spread his hands. "After all, it's not as if you hired yourself an army to fight your revolution for you. Half a dozen mechs and less than 100 men and women can do a splendid job training your cadre, but we would look pretty foolish taking on the entire Kurita garrison. I may be a mercenary, but I'm not crazy." Thorvald did not look convinced by that final statement, but the others smiled and seemed to relax a bit. "Well, now that's out of the way," Erickson said. "Let me extend to you and your people the hospitality of my plantation, if there's anything we can do." "Thank you, citizen. I have to see to my people, and you'd also better show us where to park our mechs out of sight. I don't imagine you'd care to have a Kurita recon satellite scan showing them sitting out on your front porch." "Quite right. There's nothing to fear, however. I'll have some of my people lead you around to the caves." "The caves?" He smiled. "At the north end of Fox Island, you have to understand that the polar depression we call the Sylvan Basin is the remnant of an ancient collision of a massive asteroid with our world perhaps 10, maybe hundreds of thousands of years ago. The basin rim cliffs are the rim of the crater. The impact gouged out the crater and turned the floor molten. Later, as the molten rock cooled, cracks developed. Some of these cracks became paths for streams and rivers running down from the cliffs. Vast cave systems were opened up, and one of the largest lies beneath this island. The first Scandinavian colonists of Verthandi found them and discovered that they would provide a convenient source for all the heavy and industrial metals they could use. It seems that the asteroid had concentrated various metals up close to the surface within easy reach. My grandfather founded Verthandi's largest agromech company and started it here on Fox Island Caves, where shelter was free and various metals easy to obtain and smelt. Most of the forges, casting equipment, and the big mech rigs and cradles are still there, too big to move and too useful to junk. The main manufacturing center is on Regis now, but there's a sizable mech facility still in operation on, or rather under, the island. Of course, we've seen to it that the records of its existence vanished in a tragic fire just about the time the Combine moved in. This is the primary facility for all of the rebellion's mechs and heavy machinery now. There are facilities there that your people can use as a barracks, and I assure you that your mechs will be well hidden." "Sounds ideal," Grayson said, fascinated by the description. "I doubt that we could have kept our operations secret as long as we have without the caves. The concentration of metal ores in the surrounding rocks helps screen us from enemy spy satellites and instrument probes." "Well, that being the case, there's only one thing more I need, and what is? About 20 hours of sleep. I've been on my feet, or on my mech's feet, ever since I got to Verthandi, and that was about this time yesterday. I can't even remember how long it's been since we pushed past the Kurita blockade that I've had more than a cat nap. If you'll have someone show us to those quarters, citizens, I think my people and I are due for some downtime."
And that, my friends, ends these chapters of The Mercenary Star